Kings chapter 16. That's where we will start, although it'll take me, as usual, a few minutes to get there. We've been reading through the Old Testament this year in our daily Bible readings, and we've gotten to the point now where we're talking about the portion of history called the divided kingdom. It's some of the most interesting reading to me, and I think I've said this before, the Kings and the Chronicles and the book of Samuel, stories in all of the Bible, for a lot of reasons, mainly because it's just good reading, but even more importantly, I think because of the richness of the text and the lessons that we learn and the examples that we give. And I think what's compelling and specifically important for us when we get to this part of the reading of the Old Testament is that when we read what we see happening here in the divided kingdom and the kings that come afterwards and the way that they rule and the way that God deals with them, all of these things are a end result of the cumulative effect of what has been happening from the very beginning of this story. We're now starting to see all the things that have been talked about and all the things that God has promised and all the things that God has warned about are now coming to fruition with these people. And it's one of the things I think as we read this, we think about what happened at the very beginning. We go back to Israel being brought out of Egypt, brought into the land of Canaan, and God tells them, I'm going to give you this land, I'm going to bring you in, and you're going to supplant the people that are already there. But he gives them a warning, doesn't he? If you remember in Exodus chapter 34, one of the numerous places where God makes this point through Moses, he tells them in verse 11 that observe what I command you this day. Behold, I will drive out before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. Take care lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you go, lest it become a snare in your midst. He says you're to tear down their altars. You're not to have any covenants with them. You're not to take in their sons and daughters to marry with. You're not to engage in sacrifice with them when they invite you to be a part of their lives. You need to make sure that they are not only separate and apart from you, but you need to drive them out of the land, because if they remain, they're going to be a stumbling block for you. They're going to cause you to struggle, and they're eventually going to cause you to be condemned. And so with the echoes of that warning in their mind, we see the Israelites coming into the land, and they have this intent on devoting these people to destruction. And, you know, it's interesting to hear it. And we have to keep this in mind, I think, as we read this, because so many times people will read the Old Testament and say, what a horrible book this is. This is a God that promotes genocide, that sends his people in and just wipes out these people indiscriminately and takes away their land and destroys their people and calls for the utter destruction of all these nations. And it's hard for us sometimes to answer that question until we start looking at what happens after this. What happens after Israel does defeat these people, but as it turns out, they don't actually do what God asked them to do. They don't drive them out. They don't separate themselves. And what we see in the story that we're going to talk about today, that takes place about 530 years or so after what we just talked about, after the Israelites have been led into Canaan. They have brought judgment on the Amorites and all the Canaanites and all these people, and we're going to talk about that here in a few minutes. We see the process now is starting to reverse itself. In fact, all the things that they were called to do, Israel is showing that they're not going to regard those. They go into the land, if you remember, and they go into Jericho, the first city that they decide to take over. And do you remember what happens at that point? We see an example here of two Amorite kings that are destroyed in Numbers chapter 21. Og, king of Bashan, and Sihon. And we won't go into the stories of that. But after those people are defeated, then Israel goes into the land of Canaan. They cross over into the Jordan, and the first city is Jericho, right? And we see the account of Jericho and what happens to them. The utter destruction and the determination that we're not just going to destroy Jericho, we are going to loot it. We're going to destroy it completely. And we see that there was only one person, only one family that survives that, and it was the family of Ahab. And why did they do that? Because they saw what the Israelites had done to the Canaanites, to the Amorites. In fact, Rahab says this exactly specifically over in Joshua chapter 2. She says, "We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted. There was no spirit left in any man because of you." Why? "For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath." When you come in as Israel and you defeat these nations, you're going to do it in a way that makes a statement not only to yourself, but to the nations around about you. That Israel is here, God has brought his judgment, and he's no longer going to tolerate the idolatry and the corruption that had infected these lands for hundreds and hundreds of years before that time. Those things have to come to an end. And as we said, we see Israel moving into this territory and occupying these cities. And gradually we start to see Israel, rather than chasing out this influence, embracing the influence and becoming more and more like the nations around them. And that's where we get to the story here. And as we talked about this on Friday on our call, I think we get here to a critical point in the history of Israel when we get to the story of this king Ahab. It's kind of interesting, that we read the upheaval among the tribes of Israel. We see Solomon's kingdom ripped away in half because of his own idolatry, and we see the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah established. And we see the contrast throughout the book of Kings between these two kingdoms. In one of them, obviously, when we look at Israel, it's hard not to notice the chaotic nature of their kings. In the first 50 years, they have 6 kings. It's less than 10 years per king. 4 different dynasties are established during that time. There's this chaos. There's this turmoil that characterizes it. But then we get to this part of history. And it's kind of ironic that this becomes the time when they're the most stable in their history, the time of Ahab. And yet, while it's hard to argue with Ahab's success, I think we start to see that Ahab, even in the time when Israel is flourishing, is showing us an example of everything that God has warned the people about. And the fact that now we have come to a point in history where there's just no going back. Where God has seen and said, if I don't stop Israel now, if I don't turn Israel back from the sin that they are in the path that they are going on right now, it's going to be too late for them. And so we see the description of Ahab in 1 Kings chapter 16. It says, in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, in verse 29, Ahab, the son of Omri, began to reign over Israel. And Ahab, the son of Omri, reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. And Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all who were before him. And as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, he took to his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ithbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. He erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. And Ahab made an Asherah. And Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger them than all the kings of Israel who were before him. And if you remember the quotation in 1 Kings 21 that really sums it up, is Ahab has just taken the vineyard of Naboth, whom Jezebel had killed. He is described by saying that there was none who sold himself to do what was evil in the sight of the Lord like Ahab, in going after idols, as the Amorites had done, whom the Lord cast out before the people of Israel. That's kind of an interesting side note there. We kind of just gloss over that. But we've talked about already what happened when Israel came into the land. Well, why does he bring up the Amorites here? Why are the Amorites so significant? Well, what we find, I think, a lot of times is that the Amorites, in a lot of instances, are simply used as a stand-in for all the nations around about them. They were a nation that was relatively powerful when Israel came into the land. By the time Ahab has come into power, the Amorite kingdom is essentially gone. But their influence is still there. And if you remember, this goes all the way back to Genesis 15. When Abraham is being promised the land to his descendants, and God tells him that your offspring will be sojourners in the land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted 400 years, but they will come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. Because there's this group of people here that are developing a nation, and they're becoming more and more corrupt, and at some point God is going to say, it's time, it's enough. And at that point, they're going to be taken away. And in fact, if you remember in Joshua 24, when Joshua is talking to Israel and giving them that speech, choose this day which one you will serve. You remember who he singles out? He says that if you will you serve the gods of your father in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in the land that you dwell. They were the prominent idolatrous, corrupt influence in the world at that time. And it's not the last time this is going to happen, by the way. Ahab is not unique in this. If we move forward in time to Judah, Manasseh, who is kind of the Judean version of Ahab, how is he described? He's described that Manasseh, the king of Judah, according to 2 Kings 21:10, had committed these abominations, has done things more evil than all that the Amorites did. Again, going back to that idea of the Amorites, these idolatrous people. There's a throwback there that the people of Israel and the people of Judah are now slowly becoming the very thing that they were sent in to cast out. And there's one other tie-in, if you notice in this passage, back in 1 Kings 16 that we read earlier. It's a statement that just kind of flies by us sometimes, at least it does for me. It says in verse 34 of 1 Kings 16 that in his day, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho. He laid its foundation at the cost of Abiram, his firstborn, and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Joshua, the son of Nun. And we talked about the impact that was made by Joshua coming in with the Israelites and destroying the city of Canaan, and not just destroying it, utterly devoting it to destruction. They were told, you are not going to take anything out of this city. This city is going to be completely destroyed. He says this in Joshua 6. He tells them in verse 18, but you keep yourself from the things devoted to destruction, lest when you've devoted them, you take any of the devoted things and make the camp of Israel a thing for destruction and bring trouble upon it. Now, that wasn't going to be the rule going forward for all the cities. The Israelites were able to loot and take personal possessions from a lot of the cities that they took over, but not the first one. Jericho was intended to be an example. A message not only to the people of Israel, but to the people of Canaan, that we are not going to take a part in what's going on in this land. You are not to take them as a model. You are not to just slide right into their place and become the very nation that they have been all this time. And Joshua even goes so far in verse 26 to make an oath, and saying at that time, cursed before the Lord be the man who rises up and rebuilds this city Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn shall he lay its foundation. At the cost of his youngest son shall he set up its gates. And here in the days of Ahab, 530 some years later, Jericho is being rebuilt. It doesn't say that Ahab directed it, but it's assumed that he probably did, or at least he was involved in some way. And the idea here is that at the very least, Jericho has now been rebuilt. The work that was done from the very beginning and coming into Canaan is now being reversed, because we're now in a culture in Israel where the commands and the warnings of God have stopped having any impact. They no longer fear the Lord. They no longer see the warnings that took place from the very beginning. They have embraced those things. And so Ahab, I think, as we said, brings this nation of Israel to a point where there's really no going back. And it's no wonder we were talking about this again on Friday, that we see such a flurry of activity from the prophets during this time. We see Elijah coming onto the scene here, and there's no indication, at least we're not told, of any miraculous work that the prophets had done before this time. Now, maybe there was, and we're just not told about it, but the scripture chooses to emphasize this particular point in time with Elijah and Elisha and some of the magnificent works that they have done. And there's clearly an indication here that we've come to a critical point in the nation of Israel. What's going to happen? Are they going to come back, or are they going to turn back from their ways? Or are they going to continue and follow the lead of Ahab onto destruction? And it's revealing to see, as we're going to look at these instances in Ahab's life, there's really 4 stories that we are told. And I'm going to try to go through them relatively quickly and make some general points about them. We see Ahab here in his rebellion and in his corruption, and we see Elijah coming to him. And what's interesting about it is he doesn't come to him to punish him. He doesn't come to him to right off the bat say, Ahab, you're wicked and God's going to destroy you. He comes to call him back. He comes to try to change his mind. And he does things in such a way to try to bring Ahab to repentance and to a recognition that the Lord is God. And so we see these 4 stories. The first one we're going to talk about is in 1 Kings chapter 18. And this, of course, this is the one that we probably think about more than anything else from this period. The story of Ahab and Elijah in their first real meeting. They've obviously met before, but we haven't read about it. It's the first interaction that we read about in this passage. We know that Ahab had started off praying for rain at the beginning of this chapter, and it ceased, in the previous chapter, and it ceased to rain for 3 years. And it's at this point now that God calls Elijah back and says, now I want you to come back and confront Ahab, and you're going to make a statement before him. And in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 17, we see them meeting together. Ahab greets him by saying, is it you troubler of Israel? And he answers, I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. Now therefore send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table. And we won't go through, we know the story, but we remember this dramatic scene now where Elijah builds this altar and he douses it with water while the prophets of Baal are cutting themselves and dancing around and screeching to heaven, trying to get something to happen. And yet Elijah, when he calls down to heaven, we see fire coming down, consuming the sacrifice, consuming the altar, consuming everything around it. A definitive statement that God is stronger than Baal. And as a result of that, the prophets of Baal are put to the sword. Elijah has won this great victory. And you have to imagine that Ahab, what's going through his mind while he's watching all this? He has to wonder, what are they going to do to me? After all, I'm the one that's been pushing this, I along with Jezebel. And yet what happens? What does Elijah do? He tells him, go up in verse 41, eat and drink, for there's a sound of the rushing rain. Not only does God not punish Ahab, but he even warns him to go back to the city. Elijah tells him, make sure to go back now before the rain catches you. He blesses Ahab. He doesn't curse him. It's a pretty amazing thing. God shows his benevolence and his power in the same moment. And Ahab is faced with a choice as a result of that. God has proven his superiority over Baal. Is he now going to continue his current path, or is he going to make a change based on the revelation that he has seen? And we know the answer to that. He goes back and he tells Jezebel in the first part of chapter 19 all that happened and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Now, I don't know how he went forward and what his attitude is at this point. We're not told. Did he go back with wonder in his heart and think, wow, this is an amazing thing. Maybe we've been on the wrong track about this. It's very possible that he did. Or maybe he just was so infuriated that his schemes had been foiled that he goes back and tells Jezebel, you're never going to believe what Elijah did. How are we going to stop it? We're not told, but what we are told is that Jezebel's attitude and Jezebel's influence is the one that wins the day. Because in verse 2 it says that Jezebel sent a message to Elijah saying, so may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. Ahab chose the influence of Jezebel over the influence of Elijah. And it's not really that surprising, is it? It's not surprising to see someone who gravitates to someone who can appeal to him on a fleshly level, on a sensual level, who provides the encouragement to live however I want to live, putting off all the restraints that this person over here is telling me that I need to have, as opposed to the one who's warning me that I need to change my life, warning me that the way that I'm going is defying God and I need to change those things. Even if there's also an offer of blessings. Look what God can do for you if you'll just turn back to him. We see Ahab's attitude towards Elijah, who's telling him the truth. How does he respond to him? Back over in 1 Kings 21, we'll talk about this story a little bit later. But when he sees Elijah coming to him in the vineyard of Naboth, what does he tell him? Have you found me, O my enemy? You're my enemy. You're not trying to help me. You're trying to bring ruin on me. You're trying to destroy me. You're trying to change my life. Ahab rejected God's invitations of mercy as the approaches of an enemy. It was one of his first great mistakes. Second story that we see, skipping over in chapter 19, over into chapter 20, and this is the story where God yet again tries to show Ahab mercy. Tries to show Ahab that there is a better way than what he's been doing if he will just turn and listen to God. And if you remember in verse 1 of chapter 20, it's the story of the king of Syria, Ben-Hadad, who gathers all his armies together. 32 kings were there, horses and chariots, and they went up and closed in on Samaria and fought against it. And we read down in verse 5 that the messengers came to Ahab and said, thus says Ben-Hadad, I sent to you, saying, deliver to me your silver and your gold, your wives and your children. Nevertheless, I will send my servants to you tomorrow about this time, and they shall search your house and the houses of your servants and lay hands on whatever pleases you and take it away. And the king of Israel called all the elders of the land and said, mark now and see how this man is seeking trouble. For he sent to me for my wives and my children and for my silver and my gold, and I did not refuse him. And the elders, of course, tell him, don't go along with this. And so they prepare themselves for war. And in doing so, I think there's a knowledge that there's no way we're going to win this battle, but I just can't allow this kind of indignity. I'd rather die than allow this. And yet God sends a prophet to Ahab. We're not told the name of the prophet. But he tells him, don't worry about the Syrian army. He tells him, behold, I will give it into your hand this day, and you shall know that I am the Lord. That recurring message over and over. I'm going to do this for you so that you will know that I am the Lord. And it's interesting now, Ahab's going to listen to everything God has to say right now, isn't he? Because now God's telling him what he wants to hear. And in fact, he's even asking for instructions. How will the battle go? Who will lead the battle? What do I need to do? Just tell me what I need to do to win this battle. And so he catches Ben-Hadad drinking himself drunk, and the Syrians are routed. And the prophet comes back to him in verse 22 and says, strengthen yourselves and consider well what you had to do, for in the spring the king of Syria will come against you. So again, God is going to say, look, I've defeated your enemies now, and I'm going to predict to you that next year, this time, they're going to come again. So when this happens, you'll know that you need to listen to God, because God will deliver you from these things. God has established his credibility not only in terms of his punishment of the prophets of Baal, but in his protection of the people of Israel. And so we read again in 1 Kings 20, as this next spring came about, sure enough, here comes the army of Syria. Now they're taking it seriously. If you notice, all the 32 kings who basically were out commanding the armies, Ben-Hadad has called them back and put actual commanders. In other words, we're going to put people that actually know what they're doing out there, because clearly that was the problem. And they make the excuse, well, their God is a God of the hills, so we're going to make sure to fight in the plains, and that way we'll surely win this. And so they bring back the same size of army, and now we're going to be serious. And it says in verse 27 that the people of Israel were mustered, provisioned, and went against them. And the people of Israel encamped before them like two little flocks of goats, but the Syrians filled the country. And the man of God in verse 28 came near and said to the king of Israel, thus says the Lord, because the Syrians have said, the Lord is God of the hills, but he is not a God of the valleys. Therefore I will give all this great multitude into your hand, and you shall know that I am the Lord. And sure enough, what happens? Ben-Hadad is forced to flee. He finds himself cowering in an inner room in the city, fearing for his life. He has been delivered into Ahab's hands, and what happens? Ahab hears about him, and he says, what? Does he live? He's my brother. Man who was trying to insult you and take everything away from you, the one that God has delivered you from. But Ahab, the first chance he gets, goes back and says, no, this is the person I want to ally with. This is the friendship that I want to establish. And so they enter into a parley. And the Syrians give him assurances that they will give all the cities back to Israel that they had taken. And in fact, we'll build bazaars in our cities, in your cities, and we'll share our cultures, and we'll draw closer, and we're going to increase that bond, and we're just going to be friends, and everything is going to be wonderful. And Ahab says, that's exactly what I'm looking to accomplish. That's what I want to have. Ahab chooses the faithlessness of the surrounding kingdoms, who have no intention of doing any of these things, who have shown no indication that they are trustworthy in anything, over the God that has time and again shown him that he knows, that he cares, and that he is able to do all that he has said that he will do. And so when the prophet comes back and warns him and tells him, look, because of this, you're going to pay consequences for this. Ahab's attitude, notice what it is. He goes back, it says the king of Israel in verse 43, after he's been rebuked, goes back to his house, vexed and sullen, and came to Samaria. Because God wasn't telling him what he wanted to hear anymore. He was now telling him he'd made a mistake. He'd rejected God, but he'd expected God to continue to bless him. Everything should still be fine. And that brings us, of course, to the third story in 1 Kings 20. The story of Naboth's vineyard, which, again, we're all familiar with these stories. So we won't spend a lot of time in the details. We read in verse 1, now Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard in Jezreel, beside the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. And after this, Ahab said to Naboth, give me your vineyard that I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it is near my house, and I will give you a better vineyard for it. Or if it seems good to you, I will give you its value in money. But Naboth said to Ahab, the Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers. And here we go again. Ahab went into his house vexed and sullen. And he laid down on his bed, turned away his face, and would eat no food. Now, Naboth, of course, is referring to the law that's stated back in Leviticus 25, the idea that the land shall not be sold into perpetuity. The land is mine, according to God. For you are strangers and sojourners with me. In all the country you possess, you shall allow a redemption of the land. In other words, it's not your land to give. It's not your land to sell. It's God's to give to whomever he chooses. And it's interesting that even as corrupt as things had gotten in Israel, we still see examples of people striving to follow at least some of the law. They were at least honoring that portion of the law that God had given them this land and had expected them to cherish it and to treat it with reverence and respect. And remember that. And to Ahab's credit, his first response is to honor the law. Now, that may just be the weakness of his character, that he just forgot that he could do anything about it, and just his first response is just to go pout about it. Maybe that's what it is. But he recognizes, or at least seems to, that he's limited by the teachings of the law until Jezebel confronts him. And notice when Ahab tells her the story, he doesn't say anything about what the law says. He just says he won't give it to me. He's just being mean. He's being unreasonable. And so Jezebel decides in her cunning that if we had to follow the law, then we're going to use the law to get what we want. And so she puts a plan in motion where Naboth is framed for blasphemy and for speaking against the king, and she uses exactly the way the law is intended to work. We're going to have witnesses. Now, they're false witnesses, but they're going to come forward and accuse him, and as a result of that, by the law, he will be stoned. As a result of that, he's killed. And we read in verse 16 that as soon as Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, Ahab arose to go down to the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite to take possession of it. Now notice, he didn't have any law by right to go do this. So that leads me to believe maybe he wasn't really respecting the law to begin with at the very time. But now he's been emboldened by this action. And so he's going to go down and take the land before somebody else can do it. And it's at this point that Elijah, as we said, comes and confronts him in the vineyard and tells him in verse 21, behold, I will bring disaster upon you. I will utterly burn you up. I will cut off from Ahab every male, bond or free in Israel, and I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha, the son of Ahijah, for the anger to which you have provoked me, because you have made Israel to sin. He's gone too far. This is the first time now that the threats from Elijah have become, in Ahab's mind, serious. It's almost like, again, we've seen this idea of Ahab as a petulant teenager. It's almost like if you've ever been dealing with a kid, or if you were a kid and your parents have been saying, don't do that. Well, don't do that. No. And all of a sudden you're faced with the actual consequences of it, and you say, wait, you're serious? Oh, apparently this is important. And now all of a sudden Ahab has a different reaction. How heartfelt it was, we don't know. But in verse 27, it says that when Ahab heard these words, he tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his flesh and fasted and lay in sackcloth and went about dejectedly. And, there may have been at least some change in Ahab's behavior at this point. After all, when we get to this next story, what we're going to find is that Ahab is going to be consulting the prophets of God. Now, there's some question about how honestly he's doing that. But he seems like he's at least trying to give lip service and saying, all right, fine, I will curtail the worst of my behavior. It's almost if he's saying, maybe if I just don't do anything too horrible, God will leave me alone and let me do what I want to do. Isn't that the sense that we kind of get here? I think it's pretty clear that this is not a heartfelt turn to God by Ahab. This is, I've got to figure out a way to mitigate this situation, and maybe if I can kind of pull one over on God and maybe act in a certain way, maybe that'll be good enough. And so Ahab chooses a repentance of self-pity and self-interest over a change of heart towards God. And that, of course, brings us to the last story. In 1 Kings 22, verse 3, now the things that God has promised Ahab in relation to Syria are now about to come true. because he allowed Syria to live, to Ben-Hadad to live. He is now going to suffer the consequences of that. And for 3 years, nothing happens. But finally, he looks up and notices that, guess what? The Syrians haven't fulfilled their promise because they haven't given us Ramoth Gilead back. They're still living there. And he calls Jehoshaphat to come down. And it says in verse 3 that the king of Israel said to his servants, do you know that Ramoth Gilead belongs to us? And we kept quiet and do not take it back, and we do not take it out of the hands of the king of Syria. Ben-Hadad hadn't fulfilled his promises, but God always fulfills his promises. And so we see that happening. And this story, it's kind of reminiscent in a lot of ways of what we saw with Jericho. Because what happens when, if you remember the prophecy, the promise that Elijah made back in chapter 20, verse 42, he said to them, thus says the Lord, because you have let go out of your hand the man whom I had devoted to destruction. Therefore, your life shall be for his life, your people for his people. There's that same language there that has continued to be used, that God has devoted these people to destruction, and you chose to preserve them for your own selfish interest. But even now, it's interesting that God gives him an out, because the king of Judah is there. And Jehoshaphat, who I've always said, I still believe, I know he had his faults. He was a great king. The Bible says he was a great king. But his flaw was that he got involved with somebody that he didn't need to be involved with. And it's going to cost him dearly, and it's going to cost his kingdom dearly. But at least in this case, he is the positive influence trying to get Ahab and trying to rein him in. He tells him, is there not a prophet in Israel? Is there not a prophet of the Lord? And it's interesting that he says that because Ahab has assembled 400 prophets that are allegedly prophets of God. And they're all saying the same thing. Everything's great. Go up. You will conquer all these difficulties. He says, go, the Lord will give it to the hand of the king. And something makes Jehoshaphat hesitate. Don't know what it was. There must have been something that just didn't seem right about all this. I guess it's odd that when you've got a king like Ahab and the prophets of the Lord, 400 of them are all saying that everything's going to be great. And Jehoshaphat's spidey sense or whatever starts to tingle, and he says, is there not another prophet of the Lord that we can ask? And of course, it's revealing that Ahab, when he responds, says, well, there is one. But I hate it because he never prophesies anything good concerning me, but only evil. That, by the way, is an indication that may very well be that Ahab's repentance a chapter ago probably wasn't particularly sincere. But so Jehoshaphat insists, and they send for Micaiah, whom Ahab clearly has had dealings with him already. And it's interesting that after the initial exchange, Micaiah finally comes to the actual prophecy, the actual vision that he has seen. He tells him, I saw all Israel scattered on the mountain as sheep that have no shepherd. And the Lord said, these have no master. Let each return to his home in peace. And he even explains, it's kind of interesting, when we talk about God sending false delusion to prophets, and we think, well, that's not really fair. Why would God send something and cause Ahab to believe something that's false? Isn't that basically lying? But what's ironic about this is not only does God send this false delusion to the prophets, but then he sends Micaiah and says, you tell Ahab exactly what's going on. There's no deception here at all. These false prophets are giving you a lie, and I'm giving you a choice. Do you want to believe them, or do you want to believe the word of the Lord that says that if you go and do this, exactly what Elijah told you is going to happen is going to happen. Now, what is your choice going to be? What I think is kind of interesting about this is that I think Ahab believes Micaiah. That's not how we teach this, right? That's not how we think about this. We usually say, well, Ahab refused to believe Micaiah. He decided instead to believe the words of the false prophets. I don't think that's what happens here. I think he believes that Micaiah is telling him the truth. I know that because when Micaiah first talks to him and says, yeah, sure, go, everything will be fine. You can imagine how much sarcasm must have been in this, that Ahab sees right through it and says, how many times have I told you, only speak to me the truth? That didn't mean he wanted to hear the truth. Didn't mean he was going to obey the truth. But he also didn't want anybody, he wanted to know what God had to say. It wasn't so that he could obey God, but it was because, if I know what God has planned, maybe if I'm careful enough, maybe if I order my path just the right way, maybe I can get around this. I know what God said, but I think I can find a way around Isn't that what Ahab does? Because we see how he configures things. He tells Jehoshaphat in verse 29, he says, I will disguise myself and go into battle, but you wear your robes. Well, why did he do that? Well, at the very least, he must have known that there was some ring of truth about Micaiah's statement, because he remembered what Elijah said. And as much as it seems like it when we read the story, I don't think Ahab's stupid. I think Ahab's seen more than enough to know that when God says something, he means it. And when God's prophet says something, they mean it too. And Ahab's response is, I don't care. I'm going to do what I want to do, and I'm going to see if I can figure out a way to get away with it. That is the extent to which Ahab is sunk. And we see how his plan ended, of course, in chapter 22, verse 34. A certain man drew his bow at random and struck the king of Israel between the scale armor and the breastplate. Therefore, he said to the driver of his chariot, turn around and carry me out of the battle, for I am wounded. And the battle continued that day, and the king was propped up in his chariot facing the Syrians until the evening when he died. But it is kind of interesting that Ahab is described in the face of God's rebuke. He's vexed and sullen. And we see here Ahab's death. It appears, as we said, it's this last attempt to try to get Israel to turn back. And what he has now done is he has taken the corrupting influence away. Do you notice what happens here, by the way? The armies are spared. The shepherdless sheep has returned home. God is saying, I'm not going to punish Israel for the sins of this man and his obstinance and the things that he has done. I'm going to remove him, and I'm going to give Israel one more chance. Ahab's gone. What's your excuse now? But it turns out that description of vexing, sullen, resentfulness, and stubbornness didn't just apply to Ahab, because it applied to Israel. The word for sullen there, which is often translated as stubborn or resentful, it's found in Isaiah 65 talking about Israel as a group. When Isaiah 65:2, he says, I spread out my hand all the day to a rebellious people who walk in a way that is not good, following their own devices, a people who provoke me to my face continually. That's exactly what Ahab did, wasn't it? And yet Israel is doing the same things. And it wasn't limited to Israel. Jeremiah says essentially the same thing in Jeremiah chapter 5 about Judah. In verse 23, where he says, for this people has a stubborn and rebellious heart. They have turned aside and gone away. They do not say in their heart, let us fear the Lord our God, who gives the rain in its season, the autumn rain and the spring rain, and keeps us from the weeks appointed for the harvest. They don't look at God's blessings and say, this is a sign for us to come closer to God. They don't look at the difficulties in life and say, this is God telling us that we need to repent and turn back to God. And they had the same threat given to them. If you remember, all the way back in Leviticus 26, what were they told? That if you do these things, if you do not listen to the word of the Lord, I will drive you out. Verse 27, but if in spite of all this you will not listen to me, but walk contrary to me, then I will walk contrary to you. Can you think of a more sobering, fearful thought than that? God saying, I will walk contrary to you. I myself, he says in verse 32, will devastate the land so that your enemies who settle in it shall be appalled at it. And I will scatter you among the nations. I will unsheath the sword after you, and your land shall be a desolation, and your cities shall be a waste. And we see the rest of the story, the rest of the kingdom of Israel is a march directly in this direction. From this point on, there's no going back. So what does this mean for us? As we think about this, it's a great story. It's interesting and it's compelling reading, but what does it mean in our own lives if these things are in fact written for our learning and our admonition? Well, we look at Ahab and the choices that he made along the way. Here's a man who had chance after chance to come back to God, who saw some of the most dramatic works that God had ever done, who was completely without excuse, who was blessed beyond anything he could have expected from God to do. And he rejected him at every point. Ahab rejected God's invitation of mercy as the approach of an enemy, as we said. He put his trust in the faithlessness of men over the faithfulness of God. He gambled that if he modified the worst of his behavior, that God would overlook the rest. And finally, he believed that he could find a way to avoid the outcome that God had promised. Do we ever see any of those things today? Do we find ourselves acting in those ways? Certainly we see people in the world, but do we do those ourselves? Do I value people who tell me the truth? That's what Paul wrote in Galatians 4. Remember when he's talking to the Galatians who have drifted away from the truth of the gospel. He says, have I then become your enemy by telling you the truth? They make much of you, but for no good purpose. They want to shut you out that you may make much of them. These people are telling you what you want to hear. They don't have your best interest in heart. They don't love you. They're not trying to save you. Paul says, when I preach to you the gospel and its truth, it's not always easy to hear. But it's done out of love. It's done to get you to come back to God. Do we trust people who have our best interest at heart? Where does my faith truly lie? Who am I listening to? We think about passages like 2 Corinthians 6, 14 through 17, where Paul writes, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. What partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? What fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? What portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. The idea that why am I going to put my trust in someone who doesn't have the same life as I do, who doesn't have the same priorities I do, who doesn't have the same goal in life as I do? And yeah, I'm going to put my trust that this person can direct me in the way I need to go. This person's life can be something that I can emulate or that I can incorporate into my own. Who am I listening to? Who am I trusting to show me how I can live my life in a way that is pleasing to God? When 2 Peter 2 describes the false teachers that had come into the church and were dragging people into a life of sensuality and worldliness as opposed to a life of spirituality and godliness, he describes them in verse 17 as waterless springs, mist driven by the storm. For when the gloom of utter darkness has been reserved, for speaking loud boasts of folly, they entice by sensual passions of the flesh those who are barely escaping from those who live in error. And they promise them freedom, but they themselves are slaves of corruption. Those people can't do anything for us, but God can. God has promised that if we will put our trust in Him, He will guide us in the way that we need to go. Have we convinced ourselves that God will accept us if we curb the worst of our impulses? How deep does my repentance really go? When I find something in my life that's wrong and I know that I need to give it up, how committed am I to that concept? Or am I content with keeping up the appearances? I go to the right places on Sunday, praying to God, I'm worshiping. I'm not out there committing these horrible major sins. Surely that's got to be good enough for God. Surely God will accept that much. What do we read? What does God really want from us? The story of Ahab in a lot of ways tells us God doesn't just want us to put on sackcloth and ashes and walk around and act like we're sorry. He wants us to be sorry. He wants us to turn our lives over to God. He wants us to be committed from our hearts. In Revelation chapter 2, we see this picture of the church of Ephesus as John describes it in the words of Jesus and tells them, I know you are enduring patiently and bearing up for my name's sake, and you have not grown weary. You're doing all the right things. But he says, I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love you had at first. Remember, therefore, from where you have fallen, repent and do the works you did at first. I don't know specifically what this involves. I suspect, though, that they were putting on a good show. They were going through the motions. They were doing the things that they knew that God called them to do, that were easy for them to do, that kind of had become habitual almost. Didn't require them to be uncomfortable. Didn't require them to exert themselves. Didn't require them to do anything outside of what they would normally do. And God called them to repent. Can I avoid the outcome that God has promised? Or am I convinced that I will be the exception? When we look at the way that God describes salvation and what it takes to achieve it, what does he say? Romans 8, we studied Romans 8 a few weeks ago in verse 3 through 5, or verse 4 through 5. It says that the righteous requirements of the law might be fulfilled in us who do what? Who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. What does that mean? Do we sometimes kid ourselves about that? Do we really believe it? If I'm going to be pleasing to God, my mind and my focus and my energies and my time need to be focused on spiritual things and not things of this world. But what do I do? Do I start to make, well, God understands that I've got to be able to do this. And God doesn't expect me to be spending all my time and all my resources. And maybe there's truth to that. But do we find ourselves excusing the fact that really, as it turns out, my mind really isn't on spiritual things very often? My time isn't really being spent on spiritual things very often. And in fact, more often than not, I'm focused on making my life on this world more comfortable. 1 John 2, verse 15, John says, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. That is a black and white statement. And it's a statement that I suspect that each one of us has to struggle with every day of our lives, because there's a lot in this world to love. And there's a lot of things in the world that aren't inherently wrong. But what happens over time? All the warnings that we're given, all the calls to keep your mind focused on the kingdom of God, to not get bogged down in the things of this world, at some point we look up and all of a sudden our life doesn't look any different than anybody else's. Because we've changed our priorities and we never noticed it. We see an example in Ahab, I think, of what happens when we become so rooted in our own choices in life. Our politics, our social lives, our entertainments, that we expect that God's just going to accept that, you know what, I get it, but they're fine. They go to a church of Christ. They're doing good enough, as you will. Do we take seriously the call that God has given us to go beyond these things of the world and focus on something more important? Ahab shows us, I think, more than anything else, the outcome of when we do not take God's warning seriously. Because eventually, God warns us that we will get to a place where we will not listen. We just won't see it anymore. Isn't that the point of Matthew 13:22? The story of the sower who goes out to sow, and he throws the seeds into the ground, and some of them look like they're doing really, really well, except that the weeds and the tares come up and they choke out the word. Those people never left the church. Those people never left the faith. They're still right there where they always were, but they're not doing anything because they've been smothered by the cares of the world and they never noticed it. The call for us is to be vigilant, to examine ourselves, to encourage each other every day, to remind ourselves that this world is not our home, that we're preparing for something greater. We have a wonderful blessing in front of us if we're willing to take it, if we're willing to remain faithful with all that God has asked us to be. So that's the lesson this morning. Hopefully it's been encouraging. We don't like to compare ourselves to Ahab. Nobody does. And I don't think we got any Ahabs in this room. Our call is not to become Ahab. And we have that job today and every day of our lives. So the lesson is yours. Hopefully it's been encouraging. Hopefully it's been useful and challenging as well. If there's anyone here this morning who has needs of the saints, whatever they may be, who has needs of encouragement, who has needs of prayers, who needs to make their life right with God in some way, whether you're watching online or whether you're here in the audience this morning, let us know what we can do for you as together we'll end our invitation song.